which is actually underway now, from saying that it was completely impossible, it would never happen, and that only a nihilist or a pessimist or a misanthrope could possibly imagine it as a real possibility. All these liberals are panicking now all over the place and saying the game's up, it's a catastrophe, how can we go on? Or they think that there might be what we're going through now is a kind of brief blip, and we'll get that in the politics of Europe and America.
So it seems, as I just look at the situation, that the positivists, the humanists that are also sort of scientific positivists that are writing books and speaking on this subject lately are also sort of tacitly involved in the rightward shift that's happening in...
Many of them are, I think, yes, many of them are.
Yeah.
Oddly enough.
Yeah, people that have been sort of, reliably liberal in their sort of... generally speaking, human rights and all the rest have sort of are participating now, given the demographic shifts in Europe and America, in a kind of racist, anti-immigration type of rhetoric. And it seems to me this is against the idea of progress that they themselves aspire to or believe in. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Well, it's a difficult issue because I think that... much of this, I know the situation in Europe better, although I've been in America quite a bit over the last few years, but I know the situation in Europe that better, which is that the problems around the rise of the reemergence of the far right, which I've been, by the way, warning against for about 20 years, but a complete waste of time, it partly comes from a variety of reasons, of course, but from a kind of hubristic liberalism in Europe, the idea of dissolving borders in Europe, having no borders at all, and having a gigantic labor market which extends from Stockholm to Albania, for example, so anyone could move. Anyway, it comes up against so many difficulties and tensions and traditional attachments and economic inequalities and dislocations of populations and so on, that it was sort of clear to me that it would produce a major political reaction at some point, and that was partly triggered by the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, which ended in Europe by the single European currency, which made it harder for countries like Italy, which is now run more or less by a crypto-fascist government. Something everyone said was impossible has in fact happened. It made it very difficult for them to adapt to these changes. So in fact, there's a liberal hubris involved in this as one of the preconditions of the reemergence of this far right. I mean, after all, the question has to be, why has it happened now, and why has it happened in so many different countries at this time? I mean, it can't simply be, there's a sort of queer sort of idea of evil hovering about in this liberal humanism. The liberals who've been in charge for the last 30 years they're not willing to see any errors in their policies, or if they were, they just say they weren't liberal enough.
Right.
If only we'd been, that's a kind of very ideological stance, of course. It goes against something they also claim, which is that they are highly empirical thinkers, what they're sometimes called fallibilists. They're ready to recognize when they're wrong. The current generation of liberals practically never recognizes that it's been wrong.
Right.
It always insists that the solution would be more liberalism, more strong, rather like the Marxists who studied the former Soviet Union. If only it had been Trotsky, not Stalin, everything would have been all right. These are, I think these are all so that's a kind of complicated issue, but I do agree with you to one extent to some extent, which is that many sort of rather primitive forms of scientism are being reinvented or rediscovered by these prophets of world improvement. There is a sort of hidden eugenics, not always so hidden eugenics in the agenda, which of course was a very strong feature of secular humanism up to the Second World War, which invalidated it. It was invalid already intellectually and I would say morally, but invalidated it as a public stance because of what was done by the Nazis. But that's now sort of retreating into the past. Another thing which I would mention is that a part of this reemergence of the far right, and in also the far right, has been a revival of what can only be called anti-Semitism. I mean, that's
right.
particularly so on some sections of the British far left, where there's absolutely no doubt that there's a revival of anti-Semitism. And horrifying though this is, it doesn't surprise me entirely that it's happened, because what tends to happen in times of crisis is that everyone, or many people, including it now appears liberal, progressive rationalists, look round for some group which they can demonize and claim of causing these problems. They never looked at the problems in the liberal society themselves.
Right, where it could have emerged.
So this is all very, sorry, yeah, where
it could have emerged within their own ideas.
Yes, where there were flaws in their own ideas or their policies. Not flaws only coming from not being liberal enough, but flaws in the very ideas.
Right.
That's too challenging a position to adopt. So
and threatening. I mean, I think threatening to people's identity.
Yes, because it means that the identity that they base much of their lives and hopes and expectations on, and about the way the world will be as they get older and as their children grow up, is false. And that's a frightening prospect for them.
Let me go back to something you were saying earlier about sort of this myth of human progress, or the idea of a sort of unitary human subject and vision of the world and kind of progress.
Working itself out.
Yeah. So where does that leave us regarding the notion of justice? And I know for many progressive Christians, including, progressive humanists, that the idea of justice, I mean, as a Christian, justice was grounded in the idea of God's authority, human beings created in God's image. I know you write about sort of the illusion of, I don't know if you use the word illusion, but sort of this illusion of human dignity, and that humanists try to carry over from the dignity that human beings under Christianity.
Or human uniqueness, certainly.
But I guess my question is basically, is there a notion of justice that we can put our finger on, and even if we don't believe that the arc of the universe is bending towards that justice, can we at least identify, in your mind, something that we would call just and good, and work towards it?
We can make decisions about. There are two ways to answer this. One is that I'm not a radical relativist or a postmodernist. I'd almost think of myself as a pre-modernist, actually, in some ways. But I think some of the ancient writers, religious and not religious, are, I think, incomparably wiser than many modern ones. But since I'm not a postmodernist, I do think there is such a thing as human nature, and I do think that goes with a certain set of goods and bads being species-wide. There are certain things that can be done or that can happen to a human being that are never good for that human being. Being tortured, for example, or suffering traumatic loss in infancy. These leave a permanent mark. And these, of course, are no different in this respect, no different from other animals. I mean, I used to live in California for a while back in 10 or 20 years ago, and I used to go to a number of zoos in California, and there was a clear difference between the behavior of animals in good zoos and the behaviors of animals in bad zoos. They didn't actually, in other words, the sort of postmodernist idea of the infinite elasticity of human beings, that they're just a sort of set of stories they tell themselves, and there's nothing permanent underneath that. It doesn't apply to other animals, and I would say that it's a kind of neo-Christian idea that humans are unique in this respect, especially if you're a Darwinist, which many of these progressive humanists say they are. That there is a constancy of human needs. So there are universal human values, but that by itself doesn't give you a single idea of justice or a single morality, because very often these values conflict with each other. And in fact, one way you can understand human cultures is that they emerge, human civilizations, from different settlements among these universal values. So pretty well all cultures have an idea of justice. And it may be that there are certain minimal elements of that are more or less universal. But what you definitely can't do is absolutize the current liberal conception of justice and say that's what humankind has always been kind of looking for. That's where that was there all along, which is a very implausible view actually when you think of it. What does it mean? It means that a certain sort of subset of Western Christian 20th century or 21st century opinion has stumbled on or somehow fashioned the universal human demand for justice, or a kind of universal essence for justice. Remember Pascal, after he was a Christian, he said it's a strange kind of justice that's on different sides of the Pyrenees. You remember that in the Pensée. He was quite relativistic about justice, not completely, of course, because God was in the background, but he also believed in something like human nature. Although he said habit was the second nature of human beings, but he had something in common with a skeptic like Montaigne. So, and another sort of important point is that even if we could flesh out some broader conception of justice, it would contain contradictions, practical contradictions.
Well, and this seems to be the main problem when we're talking about moral theories, whether you're, consequentialist or a deontologist. These are not absolute theories that stand by themselves. Part of the problem, or maybe the problem, and I think it's important to discuss them, but they don't, to my understanding, none of them stand on their own. You can't purely be a consequentialist. I mean, you could try, but I think you'd soon find...
some people try, and some people sort of carry it off. I mean, there's this movement called effective altruism.
Yes.
Which to me is a complete absurdity as far as I'm concerned. But you see, what they like is the idea of that they're rational.
Right.
So they apply to ethics a kind of maximizing idea, which they think is essential to being rational. So whatever's the maximal produces the maximal good or the maximal value in the world. There's a duty to pursue it. Of course, a number of questions you could ask. Where does the duty to maximize value come from?
Right.
Especially if you're an atheist.
Well, and the same could be said for the categorical imperative. I mean, where does this come from?
For any of these sort of ideas. But there's a more kind of subtle question, which is why should the seeming harmony of a theory be preferred over actual human experience, which is pretty well always been, actually, as revealed in, not so much in philosophy, but in drama and poetry and literature and art, has always been that basic human values conflict with each other.
And the working it out as we go along. Yes,
just working it out and making choices which might not be there might be many, in fact I think there are many moral dilemmas in which there is no single right answer.
Sure.
Each of us strives to get one that we're satisfied with, but it wouldn't necessarily be one that would be the best one for someone else. There might be some solutions that are so bad that no one should adopt them, but there'll be a wide range of other solutions.
Yeah.
Between which different persons in different circumstances or different cultures or civilizations or traditions or forms of life, shall we say, would make. And that seems to me to be the reality. So I'm suspicious of grand theories of human rights or grand theories of justice. I'm suspicious of them. And I think it's very easy to be carried away from them. It's better to try and stay closer to human experience and work out these dilemmas in, so to speak, local terms.
Well, and this is where I wouldn't consider myself a radical postmodernist, but I think this is to my lay understanding, sort of the initial impulse of some philosophers in France in the in the 20th century to say these grand narratives about human potential and human achievement have ended up with body counts in the millions, and to be skeptical about those stories is a useful thing.
Well, I've said somewhere that philosophies of history are rationalizations for mass murder.
Wow.
On the whole, and but I mean, I agree. That's if you like a valid insight of postmodernism, though you also find it in Montaigne.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't necessarily postmodernist.